There is a lump of baked clay, smaller than the palm of a hand, that should not exist. It was never meant to last. It was meant to be read once, absorbed, and then, perhaps, soaked in water and smoothed flat to become a different letter tomorrow. That was what clay tablets were, in the world that produced it. The paper, the whiteboard, the sticky note of the ancient Near East. Cheap, plentiful, temporary. Writing pressed into damp river earth and allowed to dry in the sun. Writing that was expected to vanish. This one did not vanish. It was catalogued, centuries after it was found, with a code that reads like a railway station number, Arus 18.147. The RS stands for Ras Shamra, the modern Arabic name of the hill in northern Syria, where, in 1928, a farmer's plough broke through the stone roof of an ancient tomb and began, without anyone knowing it, the slow recovery of a city that had been erased from the memory of the world. The tablet was written in Akkadian cuneiform, the diplomatic language of the 13th and 12th centuries before Christ. It was signed, in effect, by a king named Amarna, and it was written while his kingdom was being destroyed. He had received a letter from the king of a neighbouring maritime power, most likely the island of Alashia, which most scholars identify with Cyprus. The letter had urged him to be firm. Where are your troops? Where are your chariots? Are they not with you? Strengthen your defences. Hold your ground. Amarapi was composing his reply. My father, he wrote, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned. They did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. He was describing, in the tense and measured prose of a professional scribal tradition, the collapse of his own world. His army was not in his kingdom. It was hundreds of miles away, fulfilling his treaty obligations to the Hittite Empire, which was itself unravelling even as he wrote. His navy was also gone, sent westward to patrol the Lycian coast, where enemy fleets had been reported. His harbour was undefended. His fields were burning. And then the fire came, the palace burned, the city burned, the merchants' houses with their private libraries, the scribal schools, the 2 enormous temples on the Acropolis, the royal storerooms, all of it went up in a conflagration so total that the wooden beams turned to ash, the bronze fittings melted and flowed like water, and the mud brick walls collapsed inward and entombed whatever had not already been consumed. The people of the city, those who did not manage to flee in time, were left where they fell. No one returned to bury them. No one rebuilt the walls. No one replanted the orchards or restocked the warehouses. The name of the city was forgotten, erased so completely from living memory that for more than 3,000 years no one on earth knew it had ever been a city at all. It became a low, grassy mound near the Syrian coast, indistinguishable from 100 other low, grassy mounds, until the farmer's plough struck stone. But the tablet survived. It survived because of a particular irony of physics. The fire that destroyed everything else is exactly what preserved it. Wet clay, when exposed to intense and sustained heat, does not melt. It hardens. It fuses into something very close to ceramic, nearly indestructible, resistant to water, to time, to every agent of decay that normally consumes organic records. The flames that were meant to erase the city instead baked its last words into permanence. The tablet is a letter that was never finished. Some scholars believe it was being drafted as the attack began, and that its writer never completed the final lines. Others believe the attack caught the scribe as he was preparing the text for delivery. What is not in serious dispute is the general shape of the scene. A writer working in a room filled with the smoke of his own burning city, leaving behind a message that would never reach the person it was addressed to, and which would instead be read by archaeologists 3,200 years later by electric light, in a room his imagination could not have contained. The city was called Ugarit. It sat on the coast of what is now Syria, at a crossroads where 3 continents met. It was not an empire. It had no great armies, no ambitions of conquest. It was simply the richest trading city in the eastern Mediterranean, a port where goods from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, the Aegean, and the interior of Anatolia were exchanged, tallied, taxed, warehoused, and shipped onward. And in approximately 1190 BC, give or take a few years depending on whose chronology you trust, it was annihilated. But Ugarit did not die alone. In the same generation, within the same terrible decades, nearly every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed or contracted beyond recognition. The Hittite Empire, which had fought Egypt to a standstill and invented the world's first known international peace treaty, abandoned its own mountain capital and vanished from history. The Mycenaean palaces of Greece, those great fortified centres that would one day be remembered dimly in the legends of Agamemnon and the Trojan War, were destroyed or deserted one by one. Babylon suffered devastating raids. Assyria contracted to a shadow of its former reach. Troy, on the western coast of Anatolia, burned. Even Egypt, the oldest and most resilient civilization in the known world, barely survived, and emerged so weakened that it would never again achieve the heights of its new kingdom glory. In the space of roughly 50 years, the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, a world of sophisticated diplomacy, long-distance trade, complex bureaucracies, and shared cultural achievement, came apart. Not one piece at a time, all at once. Like a web where too many strands snapped simultaneously, and the whole structure simply ceased to hold. Scholars call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Some have called it the worst disaster in ancient history. Others have called it the First Dark Age. The archaeologist Eric Klein, in a widely read 2014 book, chose 1177 BC as the symbolic marker, the year Rameses III of Egypt fought his desperate battle against the Sea Peoples in the Nile Delta. Though the collapse was neither a single event nor confined to a single year, it was a process, a cascading failure, a slow unwinding that became, at its climax, catastrophically fast. And the most remarkable thing about it is this: we have the records, not written after the fact, not reconstructed by later historians, not mythologized into legend. We have the actual tablets, the diplomatic letters, the grain requisitions, the desperate pleas for military aid, the trade manifest that slowly went silent, the royal correspondence that shifted letter by letter from confidence to anxiety to outright terror. We have the words of the people who lived through it, pressed into clay by scribes who did not know they were recording the end of an era, preserved by the very fires that destroyed everything else around them. Tonight, we are going to read those tablets, not as archaeologists studying a distant past, not as historians assembling a timeline. We are going to read them as what they are, the last messages of a world that was ending, written by people who could feel it happening but could not stop it. We are going to listen to the voices in the clay. Let your breathing slow. Let the room around you soften. You do not need to hold anything. You do not need to follow every detail. The story will carry you, the way a river carries a leaf, gently and without hurry. We are going back 32 centuries to a world that was far more like our own than you might expect, and far more fragile than anyone living in it ever imagined. Before we can understand what was destroyed, we need to understand what existed. And what existed in the centuries before 1200 BC was something that would not be seen again on this scale for nearly 3,000 years. The Late Bronze Age was the first age of globalization. That phrase sounds modern. It sounds like something from a newspaper. But there is no better way to describe what archaeologists have uncovered when they dig through the layers of the 13th century BC. What they find is not a collection of isolated kingdoms, each sitting alone behind its walls, ignorant of the world beyond. What they find is a network, a web of trade, diplomacy, marriage alliances, shared languages, mutual dependencies, and constant communication that stretched from the western coast of Greece to the banks of the Euphrates, from the shores of the Nile to the mountains of central Turkey, and, through longer, thinner threads of intermediary trade, far beyond. The great powers of this world did not think of each other as strangers. They thought of each other as brothers. That is not a metaphor. That is the actual word they used. The Amarna Letters. In 1887, a local woman was digging in the ruins of an ancient Egyptian site called Tel el Amarna, the abandoned city of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, when she accidentally unearthed a cache of clay tablets. She had no idea what she had found. Neither did the local dealers who initially sold many of the tablets on the antiquities market before scholars realized their significance. Some of the tablets reportedly were used as fertilizer, crumbled into the soil of nearby fields, before anyone understood what they were. What she had uncovered was the royal diplomatic archive of the Egyptian pharaohs Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten. correspondence spanning roughly the middle of the 14th century BC, nearly 400 tablets in all, and they were not written in Egyptian hieroglyphs. They were written in Akkadian cuneiform, the lingua franca of Bronze Age international relations, a language that neither the Egyptians nor their correspondents in many cases spoke natively, but which they used because everyone, everywhere who mattered diplomatically had learned it. The Amarna letters, as they came to be known, transformed our understanding of the ancient world, because what they revealed was not a collection of primitive war dispatches or terse military commands. They revealed a diplomatic culture of remarkable sophistication and startling familiarity. Kings address one another as my brother. They exchange gifts, gold, lapis lazuli, horses, chariots, ivory furniture, fine textiles, jars of perfumed oil. They negotiate the terms of royal marriages with the care and precision of modern trade agreements. They complain, with evident irritation, when a gift is not sufficiently generous or when a shipment arrives late. One Babylonian king writes to the pharaoh expressing displeasure that the gold he received was not of the quality he expected. He has, he says, put the gold in a furnace and found it wanting. This is not, he writes, how one treats a brother. Another letter from a Canaanite vassal king grovels in the most elaborate terms of submission, prostrating himself 7 times, on his belly and on his back before the feet of the pharaoh, while simultaneously requesting more troops for a border dispute. The genre is so standardized that the prostration is formulaic. The substance is always, invariably, a request for something. One of the most revealing exchanges involves the pharaoh Amenhotep III and the king of Arzawa, a kingdom in western Anatolia. The Arzawan king writes in Hittite, not Akkadian, the standard diplomatic language, which suggests that his scribes either did not know Akkadian or chose not to use it. The response from Egypt is in Akkadian, as protocol required, and the exchange is businesslike and slightly tense. 2 kingdoms circling each other diplomatically, testing the possibilities of an alliance that would counterbalance the growing power of the Hittites. Another letter, from the king of Alashia, Cyprus, to the pharaoh, contains a complaint about commercial matters that reads like a message from a modern trading partner who feels shortchanged. The Cypriot king has sent copper. He expects payment. He believes the payment he received was insufficient. He makes his displeasure known in terms that are polite but pointed. And then there are the letters from Rib-Hadda, the beleaguered king of the Canaanite city of Byblos. Over 60 letters from Rib-Hadda have been found in the Amarna archive, a staggering outpouring of increasingly desperate correspondence in which the king pleads, again and again, for Egyptian military assistance against the encroaching power of a neighbouring ruler named Abdi Ashirta and his son Aziru. Rib-Hadda's letters chronicle a slow-motion catastrophe in real time. His allies are falling away, his cities are being taken one by one, his resources are dwindling, and Egypt, the great power on which he depends, is not sending help. Reading Rib-Hadda's letters in sequence is an exercise in watching a man slide from hope to desperation to something approaching despair. His language becomes more extravagant with each new appeal, more prostrations, more elaborate expressions of devotion, more urgent warnings about what will happen if Egypt does not act. And the silence from Egypt, for we have few if any responses to his pleas, is deafening. Rib-Hadda's story foreshadows by 2 centuries the fate of Amurapi of Ugarit. Both were rulers of small but strategically important cities who depended on great power protection that ultimately failed to materialize. Both sent letter after letter to distant courts, their language growing more frantic with each dispatch. Both were swept away by forces they could not resist alone. The Amarna letters remind us that the Bronze Age world was a system, a complex interlocking network of political, economic and military relationships that bound dozens of states together in a web of mutual obligation and mutual vulnerability. When the system worked, it produced unprecedented levels of prosperity and cultural exchange. When it failed, it took everyone down together. And the Amarna letters are only one archive among many. At Hattusa, the Hittite capital, archaeologists have recovered tens of thousands of tablets, the administrative and diplomatic records of an empire that controlled most of Anatolia and much of northern Syria. At Ugarit, the tablets number in the thousands as well. At Pylos and Mycenaean Thebes and Greece, tablets written in the Linear B script record palace inventories in meticulous detail. The allocation of grain, the distribution of bronze to weaponsmiths, the assignment of rowers to ships, the offerings made to the gods. This was a literate, bureaucratic, interconnected civilization, and the clay it left behind is our window into its final years. If the tablets show us the words of the Bronze Age, there is one discovery that shows us its physical reality, captured in a single, extraordinary snapshot. In 1982, a Turkish sponge diver named Mehmet Çaka was working off the coast of southwestern Turkey, near a promontory called Uluburun, when he spotted something on the seafloor that did not belong there. It looked like metal, a lot of metal, scattered across the rocky bottom at a depth of about 50 metres. What Çaka had found was the wreck of a merchant ship that had sunk around 1300 BC. And when the underwater archaeologist George Bass and his team from Texas A&M University, specifically the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, began excavating it, a process that would take 11 years of painstaking work, more than 20,000 dives, they recovered a cargo that reads like an inventory of the entire Bronze Age world, packed into a single wooden hull no more than 15 metres long. 10 tons of copper ingots, cast in the distinctive four-handled oxide shape characteristic of Cypriot production. Nearly a ton of tin, the rare and precious metal needed to alloy copper into bronze, most likely originating from somewhere in Central Asia, possibly the area of modern Afghanistan, though the exact sources remain under investigation. Together, enough raw metal to equip a small army. Canaanite jars still containing traces of resin from the terebinth tree, used in perfumery, medicine, and the preparation of unguents. Egyptian objects, including a solid gold scarab bearing the cartouche of Queen Nefertiti, a golden chalice, and ebony logs from tropical Africa. Glass ingots from Mesopotamia in cobalt blue, turquoise, and lavender, the blue so deep it looks almost black until light strikes it. Mycenaean pottery from the Aegean, Cypriot ceramics, African ebony and elephant ivory, hippopotamus teeth, ostrich eggshells, Baltic amber, which had travelled all the way from the shores of northern Europe, passed hand to hand along trade routes that stretched thousands of miles before reaching the Mediterranean. Pomegranates, figs, olives, almonds, coriander. A small collection of personal effects including stone anchors, fishing weights, sets of bronze tools, a few writing boards, and what appear to be the personal belongings of at least 2 merchants who went down with the ship. Even a pair of wooden folding writing boards, possibly the earliest known examples of their kind. The forerunners of the wax tablets that would be used across the classical world for another 2,000 years. Materials from at least 9 or 10 distinct cultural regions. Nearly a dozen civilizations represented in a single cargo hold on a single vessel. And here is the critical thing to understand. This was not a diplomatic gift ship. It was not a one-time special delivery between kings. It was a commercial vessel, one merchant ship among what must have been hundreds, making similar journeys every sailing season, carrying the lifeblood of the Bronze Age economy from port to port across the breadth of the Mediterranean. The Uluburun wreck is a time capsule. It shows us, in physical form, what the tablets describe in words, a world where no kingdom was self-sufficient, where the prosperity of each depended on the produce of all, where a complex and delicate web of maritime commerce linked civilizations together, across thousands of miles of open water. A web so tightly woven that when one strand failed, the stress passed immediately to the others, and when enough strands failed at once, the entire structure collapsed. To understand why this web was so fragile, you need to understand one material fact about the Bronze Age. It is a fact so fundamental that it gave the era its name, and yet its implications are so far-reaching that most people never fully consider them. Bronze is not a naturally occurring metal. It is an alloy, a deliberate mixture of copper and tin, combined in carefully controlled proportions, typically about 90% copper to 10% tin. Get the ratio wrong, and the resulting metal is too soft or too brittle, or too prone to casting failures. Get it right, and you have a material that can hold an edge, bear weight, resist corrosion, and be cast into almost any shape. The material that made possible the weapons, tools, agricultural implements, and prestige goods on which every Bronze Age civilization depended. Copper was reasonably available. Cyprus, whose very name some scholars believe may be etymologically related to the Latin word for copper, cuprum, though this connection is debated, had enormous deposits. Anatolia had copper mines. Egypt could access copper from the Sinai. But tin was another matter entirely. Tin is one of the rarer elements in the Earth's crust. Major tin deposits accessible to the Bronze Age world were most likely located in what is now Afghanistan, the ancient land of Badakhshan, and possibly in Cornwall, at the far western tip of Britain, though the exact sources used during the Bronze Age remain a subject of scholarly debate. In either case, both known possibilities were separated from the great civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean by vast distances and multiple layers of intermediary traders. This meant that no kingdom, however powerful, however wealthy, however militarily dominant, could produce bronze independently. Egypt needed tin it did not have. The Hittites needed copper they could not always mine in sufficient quantities. Mycenae needed both, and had to import them across hundreds of miles of sea. Ugarit, Byblos, Sidon, Tyre, and the other Levantine port cities existed precisely because they facilitated this exchange. They were the nodes through which the essential materials flowed. Trade, in the Bronze Age, was not a luxury. It was not an optional enhancement to an otherwise self-sufficient economy. It was structural, foundational. Without it, armies could not be equipped, fields could not be properly worked, temples could not be built, and the entire apparatus of palace civilization, the scribes, the priests, the administrators, the artisans, could not be sustained. Every kingdom depended on materials that came from far away, and the routes those materials travelled were long, exposed and vulnerable to disruption by piracy, warfare, political instability, or, as we shall see, the slow, grinding pressure of environmental change. The Bronze Age world was efficient, it was productive, it was culturally rich and diplomatically sophisticated, but it was not resilient. It was optimized for a world in which the trade routes stayed open, the harvest came in, the rains fell on schedule, and the political arrangements that kept the whole system functioning remained stable. And around the middle of the 13th century BC, every one of those assumptions began to fail. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a map. Not a political map in the modern sense. No nation-states, no straight borders, no unified languages or currencies. A map of something older and looser than that. A map of cities and palaces, river valleys and mountain passes, harbours and trade winds. In the Far East, where the Tigris and Euphrates meet the marshes of southern Mesopotamia, the ancient city-states of Sumer had long since been absorbed into the Kassite kingdom of Babylon. Its capital, simply called Babylon, was already old. Nebuchadnezzar I would not rule there for another century, and Nebuchadnezzar II, the one who destroyed the first temple in Jerusalem, would not be born for 600 years yet. But the city was there, already one of the most storied places on earth, rich with libraries, temples, and the accumulated memory of civilization. To the north and east, along the upper Tigris, Assyria was quietly expanding under a dynasty of kings who would eventually produce the terrifying military empire of the 8th and 7th centuries. At this moment, around 1250 BC, Assyria was still a middle power, formidable, disciplined, and cautious. South of these river kingdoms along the Nile, Egypt was in the middle of what we call the New Kingdom, the era of Tutankhamun, already a century in the past, of Ramesses II, the great pharaoh whose reign was a byword for grandeur, and eventually of his son Merneptah, who would write about the sea peoples for the first time. The pharaohs of this period ruled an empire that stretched from deep in Nubia to the southern Levant, punctuated by garrison towns and temples that functioned as outposts of Egyptian power along the trade routes of the eastern Mediterranean. Across the Sinai, in the Levantine corridor between Egypt and Mesopotamia, a chain of port cities lined the coast. Byblos, ancient already, had been trading cedar with Egypt for more than 1,000 years. Sidon and Tyre, which would centuries later produce the Phoenicians, were still under the shadow of larger powers. Further north, at the top of the Syrian coast where the mountains meet the sea, sat the richest of them all, Ugarit, whose harbour faced westward towards Cyprus, and whose streets ran with 7 different writing systems. Cyprus itself, called Alatia in the tablets, was the copper island, the single most important source of the base metal for Bronze Age weapons and tools. Its principal cities, Enkomi and Kition, Kalavassos and Hala Sultan Teke, grew wealthy on the strength of the mines inland and the ports that faced every direction of the compass. To the west of the Syrian coast, across the stretch of sea that separates the Levant from Anatolia, rose the high plateau of what is now Turkey, and on that plateau, in the heart of the Anatolian highlands, stood the capital of the Hittite Empire. Imagine a city that does not look like a city you know. Hattusa sat at an altitude of more than 1,000 metres above the sea, built into a landscape of rocky outcrops, steep gorges and high pasture. Its defences were natural as much as engineered. Cliffs and ravines folded into the masonry walls. Its builders had incorporated the bones of the mountain itself into their fortifications. The site covered more than 400 acres at its height. Its defensive walls, when the final extensions were completed under Tudhaliya IV in the 13th century, ran for an estimated 6 kilometres or more. They incorporated massive stone foundations, mud brick superstructures, towers at regular intervals, and elaborate gate structures flanked by carved monumental sculptures, lions, sphinxes, a figure of a warrior god cut from the living stone, all designed to impress the visitor and intimidate the approaching enemy. Inside the walls, the city climbed the terrain in tiers. The lower city clustered around the great temple, a massive complex dedicated to the storm god Teshub and the sun goddess Amarna, whose spacious courtyards and ceremonial magazines dominated the religious landscape. The upper city, reached by long ascending streets, held additional temples, more than 30 have been identified, and the royal palace on the citadel of Bukal, from which the Hittite kings conducted the business of empire. The palace archives were not metaphorical. They were rooms, physical rooms, lined with wooden shelves on which clay tablets rested according to a careful cataloguing system. More than 30,000 tablets have been recovered from Hattusa to date, written in multiple languages: Hittite, Akkadian, Hurrian, Luwian, Sumerian, Palais. The archive contained treaties, legal codes, letters, royal annals, religious rituals, omens, medical recipes, mythological texts, and enormous cycles of festival proceedings that specified, day by day, exactly what offerings were to be made, in what sequence, and by whom. The Hittites were not merely warriors, though their military power was legendary. They had fought Rameses II of Egypt to a draw at the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC, perhaps the largest chariot battle in all of recorded history. They had then done something arguably more remarkable. They had negotiated. The resulting treaty between Hattusili III of Hatti and Rameses II of Egypt, concluded around 1259 BC, survives in both Egyptian hieroglyphic and Hittite cuneiform versions. It is the oldest international peace treaty whose text survives, containing provisions for mutual defence, the extradition of fugitives, the return of refugees, and oaths sworn before the gods of both nations. A replica hangs in the United Nations building in New York as a symbol of the human capacity for negotiation over conflict. The Hittite legal code, also preserved on tablets from Hattusa, shows a society that governed itself through written statutes. Compared to the harsh penalties of the earlier Babylonian code of Hammurabi, the Hittite laws were notably more moderate, favouring compensation and restitution over execution and mutilation. A man who blinded another in a fight did not, under the Hittite laws, lose his own eye in return. He paid a fine, a fixed weight of silver, to compensate the injured party. This approach to justice suggests a society that valued social harmony and economic continuity over retributive punishment. The Hittites were also engineers. The water management systems at Hattusa were sophisticated and extensive. The builders cut large storage ponds into the hillsides. Archaeological surveys suggest some of these reservoirs could extend over 26 metres in length and reach depths of up to 8 metres. Underground granaries sealed to be airtight stored enough grain to sustain the population through periods of drought. In one silo complex alone, excavators estimated storage capacity sufficient to feed the city for a year or more. All of this, the law, the diplomacy, the architecture, the bureaucracy, the religious infrastructure, depended on two things: food and loyalty. And in the final decades of the 13th century BC, both were running out. If we travel west across the Aegean, we enter another world, one that is recognisably related to the Hittite world by trade and diplomacy, but profoundly different in character. The Mycenaean civilization of mainland Greece was, in its own way, as sophisticated as any Near Eastern kingdom. But it was not an empire. It was a constellation of palace centres, each controlling a surrounding territory, linked by trade and shared culture, but probably never unified under a single ruler. Mycenae itself in the northeast Peloponnese was the largest and wealthiest. Tiryns, a few miles away, was a rival and perhaps a partner. Pylos controlled the western Peloponnese from the palace of Nestor. Thebes dominated central Greece. Orchomenos was wealthy in grain. Athens, Iolkos in Thessaly, and numerous smaller centres completed the picture. At its peak around 1350 BC, the citadel and lower town of Mycenae alone supported a population of approximately 30,000, large by Bronze Age standards for a European city. Its walls were constructed of stones so massive that later Greeks, unable to believe ordinary men could have moved them, attributed their construction to the Cyclopes. The Lion Gate, a monumental entrance flanked by a triangular relief of two lions rearing against a central column, still stands, one of the oldest major works of European monumental sculpture. The so-called Treasury of Atreus, a domed tomb just outside the citadel walls, is a single corbelled vault more than 13 metres in diameter, a structural achievement that would not be surpassed in Europe until the Romans built the Pantheon more than 1,000 years later. The Mycenaean palaces were centres of a redistributive economy of remarkable complexity. The Linear B tablets recovered from the palace archives, tablets that were, like those at Ugarit and Hattusa, preserved by the fires that eventually destroyed the palaces, record the allocation of resources in meticulous detail. Individual workers are named by occupation. The quantities of bronze allocated to individual smiths are specified. The number of sheep and goats in particular flocks is recorded. Religious offerings to specific deities at specific sanctuaries are enumerated. Among the deities named in these tablets are recognizable forerunners of the Olympian gods of classical Greece: Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Athena, Artemis, Hermes, and Dionysos among them. The Mycenaeans worshipped these gods 5 centuries before Homer composed the Iliad, and they recorded their worship in writing, in the only writing system their world possessed, a syllabic script of about 87 signs that was used almost exclusively within the palace bureaucracy. Linear B was not an alphabet. It was a complex system that required years of specialised training to master. There is no evidence that ordinary Mycenaean citizens were literate. Writing, in this world, was a tool of centralised administration, a technology by which the palace kept track of the resources it controlled. When the palaces fell, that tool would disappear along with the institution that had sustained it. The Mycenaeans called themselves, in Linear B, something like the Achaioi, the Achaeans. It is a word Homer would use centuries later to refer to the Greeks who fought at Troy. Which brings us to the place where east meets west. On the northwestern coast of Anatolia, at the mouth of the Dardanelles, the narrow strait that connects the Aegean to the Sea of Marmara, and through the Bosphorus to the Black Sea, sat a fortified city whose position on the great waterway gave it a significance out of proportion to its size. The Greeks would remember it as Ilion, or Troy. The Hittites, in their diplomatic correspondence, called it Wilusa. For generations, historians argued about whether the two names referred to the same place. Linguistic evidence now suggests strongly that they did. Troy 6, as archaeologists designate the city of the mid-2nd millennium BC, was a major late Bronze Age settlement with steep fortified walls and a sprawling lower town. Its population was equal in size to that of second-tier Hittite settlements, and it had a distinct northwest Anatolian culture with extensive foreign contacts, including regular commercial connections with Mycenaean Greece. Around 1300 BC, this Troy 6 was destroyed, most likely by an earthquake, based on the patterns of damage in the archaeological record: collapsed masonry, subsided foundations, widespread structural failure, but no evidence of burning or of victims left in the debris. The inhabitants survived, rebuilt, and created Troy 7A, which continued the same material culture and reused many of the previous city's surviving structures, including the massive citadel walls. But the character of Troy 7A was different. The citadel grew crowded. Small houses were squeezed into previously open areas. Enormous storage jars, pithoi, some of them large enough for a person to climb into, were sunk into the floors of these houses, their rims flush with the ground. This was a population preparing for hard times, hoarding grain and oil against possible disruption. Foreign imports declined. The confident cosmopolitan Troy of the 13th century was becoming more defensive, more inward-looking, more anxious. Hittite tablets from this period mention Wilusa repeatedly. There is a treaty, the so-called Alexandru Treaty, concluded between the Hittite king Muwatalli II and a ruler of Wilusa named Alexandu, in which the Wilusan king acknowledges Hittite overlordship and agrees to provide troops and tribute in exchange for protection. Whether Alexandu is linguistically connected to the Greek name Alexandros, which Homer uses as an alternate name for Paris of Troy, is a matter of continuing debate. Other Hittite tablets mention the Ahyawa, a kingdom across the sea whose name most scholars now identify with the Achaeans, the Mycenaean Greeks. The Tawagalawa letter, dated to around 1250 BC, is a remarkable document in which a Hittite king, probably Hattusa III, writes to the king of Ahyawa about a dispute. The letter acknowledges the Ahyawan ruler as a great king, a peer of the Hittite emperor. It refers to a previous conflict in which the two powers had quarrelled over Wilusa, Troy. We have, in other words, Hittite documentary evidence of a conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks and the power that controlled Troy, dating to roughly the right period, mentioning roughly the right names. This is not proof of the Trojan War as Homer tells it, but it is, at minimum, proof that the kind of conflict Homer describes was not merely mythological. The world Homer sang about centuries later had existed. Armies had crossed the sea, cities had been besieged, and Troy, standing where it did at the great maritime crossroads between continents, had been caught up in conflicts whose echoes would survive in oral tradition for 500 years. Troy 7a would be destroyed, violently, around 1180 BC. Its destruction layer, excavated first by Heinrich Schliemann in the late 19th century, and then with increasing archaeological rigour by Wilhelm Dörpfeld, Karl Blegen, and Manfred Kaufmann in the 20th, contains clear evidence of attack. Arrowheads embedded in walls, unburied human bones in the streets just inside the south gate and in two of the houses, heaps of sling bullets piled and not cleaned up, the sort of accumulation that a defending garrison would have gathered and stored for another day, had there been another day. The sort of accumulation a victorious attacker has no reason to tidy. Troy was not alone in its fate, but it was one of the first. Back on the Syrian coast, Ugarit's harbour was busy. The royal palace, with its 90 rooms and 8 enclosed courtyards, was only the largest structure in a city whose streets were lined with the houses of wealthy merchants, high priests and royal officials. 2 private libraries have been excavated so far, one belonging to a diplomat named Rapanu, the other to a merchant named Urtenu. Urtenu's house alone yielded some 650 clay tablets, a personal archive spanning the final decades of the city's existence. 7 scripts were in use in Ugarit simultaneously: Ugaritic cuneiform, Akkadian cuneiform, Sumerian, Hurrian, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Luwian hieroglyphs, and Cypro-Minoan. The Ugaritic alphabet itself, with its 30 characters, 1 character per sound rather than per syllable or per whole word, was a revolutionary simplification that anticipated every alphabetic writing system in the Western world. A clay tablet from the royal palace, discovered in 1948 and still preserved in the National Museum of Damascus, lists the 30 characters of the alphabet in order, one of the earliest known examples of anyone, anywhere, writing down an alphabet as a reference list. Literacy in Ugarit may have been broader than in most Bronze Age cities. The alphabet is not difficult to learn, and the fact that merchants like Urtenu maintained their own private archives suggests that reading and writing had spread somewhat beyond the narrow professional class of palace scribes. South of Ugarit ran the other great trading cities of the Levantine coast: Byblos, Beirut, Sidon, Tyre, and further inland at the Euphrates crossing, the great commercial city of Emar. Each of them had its own kings, its own temples, its own trading relationships. Each was technically subject to Egyptian or Hittite overlordship, depending on which great power had last asserted suzerainty. None of them were self-sufficient. All of them depended on the continued functioning of the wider system, and each of them, in the coming decades, would either be destroyed or would survive only by being radically transformed. The map we have just drawn, Babylon in the east, Egypt in the south, Hattusa on its mountain, Ugarit and Byblos on the coast, Cyprus rich in copper, Troy at the straits, the Mycenaean palaces scattered across the Peloponnese and central Greece. This was the map of the last confident generation. This was the world that believed itself permanent, and it had perhaps 40 years left. The collapse of the Bronze Age did not begin with an invasion. It did not begin with a battle. It did not begin with a dramatic event that everyone recognized as the start of something catastrophic. It began with a word, The word was biru. In Akkadian, the language in which the diplomats and scribes of the Bronze Age conducted their international correspondence, biru means hunger. And around the middle of the 13th century BC, this word begins appearing in the clay tablets with a frequency that had no precedent. Biru, hunger. It appears in letters from Ugarit. It appears in Hittite administrative correspondence. It appears in Egyptian records. It creeps into the margins of routine diplomatic exchanges like a shadow moving across a sundial, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then with gathering speed until it darkens everything. The first unmistakable sign that something was wrong came from the Hittites. Starting around the time of the great king Tudhaliya IV, who ruled from approximately 1237 to 1209 BC, the tablets from Hattusa begin to tell a story of hunger. Not the ordinary seasonal shortage that every agricultural society experiences from time to time. Something deeper, something structural. A Hittite official wrote to a counterpart in Ugarit in terms that scholars have found striking for their emotional directness. He asks, not demands, asks, for grain shipments. He frames the request in almost personal language. If there is any goodness in your heart, he writes, then send even the remainders of the grain supplies I requested, and thus save me. This is not the language of imperial command. This is the language of someone who is afraid. And the requests escalated. Tudhaliya IV himself, writing to the king of Ugarit, demanded a ship and crew for the transport of a massive quantity of grain. Scholars have estimated the amount at roughly 450 tons, based on the ancient units specified in the tablet, though the precise conversion remains debated. This was not a diplomatic gift. This was not a standard trade shipment. This was emergency food relief on a massive scale. And the tablet concludes with a phrase that has haunted everyone who has studied it since its discovery. It is a matter of life or death. The most powerful empire in Anatolia, the civilization that had humbled the pharaohs of Egypt, was begging a trading city for emergency grain to keep its people alive. And Egypt remarkably stepped in. The pharaoh Merneptah, son and successor of Rameses II, recorded on a stele that he had dispatched grain shipments to the Hittite lands, grain sent to keep alive the land of Hatti. Think about what that means. The Hittites' greatest rival, the power against which they had fought the largest chariot battle in recorded history just a generation earlier, was now sending them food aid, not out of generosity, out of the pragmatic understanding that if the Hittite Empire collapsed, the entire international order from which Egypt also benefited would be destabilized. The hunger was not confined to one kingdom. It was spreading. For a long time, the grain letters raised as many questions as they answered. Drought was an obvious suspect, but ancient texts are not weather reports. Kings and scribes recorded what concerned them politically and economically, not atmospheric conditions. To know what was actually happening to the climate of the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, scientists had to look elsewhere. They looked in lake beds. They looked in caves. They looked at the rings of ancient trees. Deep in the Judean hills of Israel, about 40 kilometers east of the Mediterranean coast, lies a karstic cave called Sorek. It was discovered in 1968 during quarrying operations. Within its chambers, stalactites and stalagmites have been growing, drip by patient drip, for hundreds of thousands of years, each layer of calcite crystal recording, in the isotopic composition of the water that laid it down, the climate conditions of the year in which it formed. Teams led by the geochemist Miriam Bar Matthews of the Geological Survey of Israel, working with collaborators at the Hebrew University and internationally, have extracted and analysed these speleothems for decades. The records they preserve extend continuously through hundreds of thousands of years and provide one of the most detailed paleoclimate archives anywhere on Earth. And what the Sorek cave record shows for the transition from the 13th to the 12th century BC is unambiguous, a shift toward drier conditions. Rainfall, in the eastern Mediterranean of the late Bronze Age, was declining. It was not the only such record. In the late 20th and early 21st century, researchers began extracting sediment cores from lake floors across the eastern Mediterranean. Long tubes of compacted material, laid down layer by layer over millennia, each layer preserving a chemical and biological record of the conditions that prevailed when it was deposited. The pollen record in these cores told a dramatic story. In layers corresponding to the centuries before 1200 BC, the pollen of wheat, barley, olive, grape, and other cultivated crops is abundant, reflecting a landscape under active and productive agriculture. but in layers corresponding to the period around and after 1200 BC, the cultivated pollen diminishes sharply and is replaced by the pollen of drought-tolerant scrub plants, the kind of hardy, sparse vegetation that takes over when the landscape dries out beyond what cultivated crops can endure. This shift appeared not in one core, not in one location, but across multiple sites, from Cyprus to the Levant to the southern shores of Anatolia to mainland Greece. The drought was regional, it was severe, and it was prolonged. Tree ring data told the same story from a different angle. In 2023, researchers led by Sturt Manning at Cornell University published a study in the journal Nature, analysing the growth rings of ancient juniper timbers recovered from the Midas Mound tumulus at Gordian in central Anatolia, roughly 230 kilometres west of the Hittite capital. By measuring both the width of the rings and the stable isotope ratios preserved in the wood, they were able to identify an unusually severe and sustained period of drought dating to approximately 1198 to 1196 BC. 3 consecutive years of punishing dryness, set against a broader trend of increasingly arid conditions that had been building for decades. 3 consecutive years of severe drought in a semi-arid region that depended on winter rainfall for its agriculture. 3 consecutive years in which the fields turned white, as an ancient Mesopotamian poet had written of an earlier catastrophe. 3 years in which the great grain stores of the Hittite heartland, stores that archaeologists would later find empty when they excavated the ruins, simply could not be refilled. The timing is precise. The tree ring data and the historical record converge. The drought hit the Hittite heartland at exactly the moment when the empire's tablets fall silent, when Hattusa was abandoned, and when the political entity that had shaped the international order of the ancient Near East for nearly 5 centuries simply ceased to exist. The great kingdoms of the Bronze Age were not destroyed by an invading army. They were weakened first, weakened by hunger that arrived not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a slow, grinding erosion of their agricultural base. An erosion that hollowed out their ability to pay soldiers, maintain infrastructure, hold the loyalty of vassal states, and keep the wheels of their complex economies turning. The famine came before the fall, and the tablets recorded it. Return now to the mountain city. The wind moves through Hattusa still, though the people are long gone. The German archaeological teams that have worked at the site since the early 20th century, Hugo Winkler, Kurt Bittel, Peter Neve, Jürgen Zieher, Andreas Schachner in sequence, have uncovered a story whose final chapter is stranger than any invasion narrative. Hattusa, in its last years, was an empire in slow crisis. Succession disputes multiplied after the death of Hattusili III. The late Hittite period saw a series of contested kingships, with brothers and cousins competing for the throne. Each new ruler spent political capital shoring up support that his predecessors had been able to take for granted. The language of the royal correspondence shifts perceptibly. Where earlier Hittite kings wrote with the confident brevity of men accustomed to being obeyed, the later letters are longer, more anxious, full of reassurances and repeated invocations of divine authority. As if the kings themselves were no longer entirely sure their authority would hold, vassal states along the Syrian coast began testing the boundaries. Tribute payments arrived late, or not at all. Hittite letters to their subject cities took on a sharper tone, threatening divine punishment, invoking the wrath of the gods. But threats only work when backed by force, and the force was increasingly difficult to project. Armies require grain, and the grain was running short. There were raids. The tablets mention attacks on Hittite territory by groups that scholars have identified with the Kaska peoples of the northern frontier, a persistent threat throughout Hittite history. Semi-nomadic tribes from the forested hills along the Black Sea coast, who had always pressed against the Hittite borders and who, in earlier centuries, had occasionally sacked outlying cities. Some researchers have suggested that it may have been the Kaska, rather than the Sea peoples, who delivered the final blow to the already weakened Hattusa, though this remains uncertain. What the tablets do show clearly is that these were the opportunistic strikes of neighbours who sensed weakness, who could see the vulnerability of a state that could no longer adequately garrison its borders. And through all of this, the grain requests continued. The final known Hittite king, Suppiluliuma II, named after his illustrious great-grandfather, though the resemblance was largely nominal, appears to have been a competent ruler presiding over an impossible situation. The tablets suggest he fought naval battles off the coast of Cyprus, probably against the same maritime forces that were beginning to press the Levantine coast. He may have won some of them, but a competent man, in the grip of an environmental collapse that his engineers and priests could not reverse, cannot save a civilization by himself. The rain that was not falling could not be commanded back by any ritual. And then, at some point within the first decades of the 12th century BC, something strange happened at Hattusa. The city was not conquered. It was not stormed by a victorious enemy. The archaeological evidence, carefully analysed by the German archaeologist Jürgen Seeher during decades of excavation from the 1990s onward, tells a very different story. Hattusa was abandoned, deliberately, systematically, over a period that may have spanned years rather than days. The royal administration appears to have left first, taking with it the most valuable and portable objects, gold, silver, statuary, and crucially the most important official records. The most recent Hittite royal tablets from Hattusa are not there. They are missing. Wherever the last kings and their court went, they took their most essential documents with them. The population followed, the houses were emptied, objects of everyday use were picked over and the most useful items removed. By the time the final fires were set, the city was largely empty, and there is evidence suggesting that the Hittites themselves may have set those fires. The archaeological pattern, the orderly removal of valuable objects and records before the burning, is more consistent with a deliberate destruction by the departing inhabitants than with an enemy sacking. Based on what the excavations reveal, the most likely scenario is that the royal administration chose to destroy what they could not carry, rather than leave it intact for whoever might come after. Why? The tablets do not tell us. The Hittites themselves kept no record of their own ending. An empire that had documented its existence with a bureaucratic thoroughness unmatched in the ancient world simply stopped writing. There is no final entry, no last dispatch, no farewell inscribed in clay. There is only silence, and then ashes. Recent archaeological investigations have complicated this picture somewhat. There are signs that agricultural communities with a material culture quite different from the Hittites moved into the ruins relatively quickly, perhaps within a generation. The site was not left entirely empty for centuries. Life continued in some diminished form among the ruins, but the Hittite state, the apparatus of empire, the diplomatic networks, the legal system, the military machine, the scribal schools that had kept those 30,000 tablets, that was gone, and it would not return. The fire that consumed the empty shell of Hattusa baked the last remaining tablets so hard that they survived more than 3,000 years. They waited in the ruins, buried under layers of collapse and accumulating earth, until European archaeologists began excavating the site in the early 20th century. When they emerged from the ground, they brought with them the voices of a vanished world, and those voices, preserved by the same element that had destroyed everything around them, spoke of hunger, of fear, of borders that could not be held, and of a king who demanded grain in a matter of life or death, and received in the end nothing but silence in return. Where the royal family went, no one knows. Some scholars speculate that they may have retreated southward to the regional centre at Carchemish on the Euphrates, which survived the collapse and became the seat of what historians now call the Neo-Hittite successor states, preserving elements of Hittite culture, language, and art for another 500 years. If so, then some fragment of the empire may have continued in diminished form far from its original capital, but the imperial state as the Bronze Age had known it, with its mountain palace, its vast archives, its diplomatic correspondence with pharaohs and kings, that was over. The wind moves through the ruins still. The walls stand in outlines. The Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate still preside over entrances to a city that no one has lived in for 3,000 years. And the tablets, baked to permanence by the final fire, sit now in museums in Ankara and Istanbul, in Berlin, in Oxford, where patient scholars continue to read them, sentence by sentence, and hear in their careful phrasing the voices of a civilization that understood more than we often credit about the world it lived in, but could not in the end save itself from the forces its understanding could not master. Travel west again now, across the Aegean to the mountainous landscape of southern Greece. The first Mycenaean palace to fall was almost certainly Thebes. Around 1300 BC, perhaps earlier, the great palace at Thebes in central Greece was destroyed by fire. The destruction was not part of a wider wave. It was, as far as the archaeological record suggests, isolated, perhaps the result of a localized conflict. perhaps of internal strife. The city was not immediately rebuilt at the same level. Its power diminished. Its former territories were absorbed by neighbours. At Mycenae itself, around the same period, there were signs of trouble. Houses outside the citadel walls were destroyed in episodes of violence and were not rebuilt. In response, the Mycenaean rulers did something revealing. They strengthened their defences. The walls of the citadel were thickened. A secret cistern was constructed underground outside the walls, giving the defenders access to water during a siege. Similar access to springs was constructed at Tiryns and Athens. The inhabitants of these great fortresses, who had lived for generations without serious threat from outside, were beginning to prepare for something. Then the Great Wave came. Between approximately 1200 and 1180 BC, one Mycenaean palatial centre after another was destroyed. Pylos in the southwestern Peloponnese was burned to the ground. Tiryns was devastated. Mycenae itself was burned. Not completely, not all at once, but in a series of episodes that progressively weakened the palace as a functioning institution. The smaller centres followed: Iolkos in Thessaly, Orchomenos, Gla, Eleusis, and others, each of them palatial complexes that had sustained the Mycenaean civilization for centuries, ceased, over the course of perhaps 2 generations, to function as palaces. Not every site was destroyed violently. Some were simply abandoned. Others were partially reoccupied after their initial destruction, but at a much reduced level. The administrative apparatus of the palaces, the scribes, the record keepers, the redistributive economy, was gone. And with the disappearance of the palaces, the need for Linear B, the syllabic writing system that had existed only to serve them, disappeared as well. This is the remarkable and terrible fact. After approximately 1200 BC, writing disappeared from Greece, not for a year, not for a generation, for 400 years. The Greek Dark Ages, as they are called with brutal accuracy, stretched from approximately 1100 to 700 BC, 4 centuries during which the Greeks produced no written records that survive, 4 centuries of human experience in one of the most consequential regions of the ancient world, and we have no words from those who lived through it. When writing returned to Greece, it would not be in Linear B, it would be in the alphabet, borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians, who had in turn inherited the commercial ethos of the old Levantine trading cities. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Of all the Mycenaean sites, Pylos provides perhaps the most intimate glimpse into the final hours of a Bronze Age palace. The Palace of Nestor, as it is known, named after the wise old king of Pylos who appears in Homer's Odyssey, was a sprawling complex in the southwestern Peloponnese, overlooking the Bay of Navarino. It was excavated by the American archaeologist Carl Blegan of the University of Cincinnati, beginning in 1939 and resuming after the Second World War. What Blegan's team found was both magnificent and heartbreaking. The palace had been destroyed by fire around 1180 BC. The conflagration was so intense that it fused some of the stone blocks and left a thick layer of carbonized debris across the entire site. But the same fire as at Ugarit and Hattusa baked the clay tablets in the palace archive into permanence. Approximately 1,100 Linear B tablets were recovered from Pylos. Blegan found them almost immediately in his very first trial trench, which cut through what turned out to be the palace archive room on the first day of excavation. The significance was not lost on anyone present. Here, at last, were written records from a mainland Greek palace, the kind of document that would, if it could be deciphered, revolutionize understanding of the Mycenaean world. But Linear B had been first encountered on Crete, at Knossos, by Sir Arthur Evans, who had attempted for decades without success to crack it. When Evans died in 1941, the decipherment was still unsolved. The tablets from Pylos, unable to be read, sat in storage through the war. Publication was delayed. It would take another decade, and the intervention of an English architect with no formal training in classics, before the Linear B tablets would begin to speak. The story of the decipherment deserves, for a moment, its own quiet telling, because it is one of the most remarkable achievements of 20th century scholarship, and because without it, we would still not know what the last Mycenaean palaces were doing as they burned. Michael Ventris was born in 1922 in Hertfordshire, England. He was the only child of an army officer father who retired early due to ill health, and a Polish mother from a wealthy Jewish family. As a boy, he was fascinated by languages. By age 14, he had already developed an amateur's competence in cryptography. In 1936, at the age of 14, Ventris attended a lecture in London by Sir Arthur Evans, then 85 years old. Evans, who had discovered the Linear B tablets at Knossos and dedicated much of his life to them, described the script he had been unable to read. During a question period, young Ventris spoke up to confirm that Linear B was still undeciphered. He returned home determined to solve the puzzle. By 18, Ventris had published a paper in the American Journal of Archaeology arguing, incorrectly as it turned out, that the language of Linear B was related to Etruscan. He was drafted into the Royal Air Force during the Second World War and served as a navigator. After the war, he returned to Britain, completed his training as an architect, and continued his Linear B work on the side. In 1952, on the evening of Whitsunday of the 1st of June, Ventris was at home in his Hampstead house, working on Work Note 20 of his ongoing research. He titled the note with characteristic British understatement, "Are the Knossos and Pylos tablets written in Greek?" He called it a frivolous digression that would sooner or later come to an impasse or dissipate itself in absurdities. It did not. Over the next weeks, Ventris tested the hypothesis that the underlying language was an archaic form of Greek. The test that confirmed it involved identifying place names. Tablets from Knossos contained words that did not appear on tablets from Pylos, and vice versa, suggesting these were local place names. Ventris guessed that certain sign combinations on the Cretan tablets might correspond to known ancient Cretan place names like Amnisos, the harbour of Knossos. The guess, applied with rigour and then tested against other tablets, held up. On the 1st of July 1952, Ventris announced the decipherment on a BBC Third programme radio broadcast. During the last few weeks, he said, "I have come to the conclusion that the Knossos and Pylos tablets must, after all, be written in Greek, a difficult and archaic Greek, seeing that it is 500 years older than Homer, and written in a rather abbreviated form, but Greek nevertheless." The broadcast was heard by John Chadwick, a Cambridge classicist who had worked on code breaking at Bletchley Park during the war. Chadwick wrote to Ventris immediately, offering his help if there is anything a mere philologist can do. The two began a collaboration that would, over the next 4 years, firmly establish the decipherment and open a window onto the world of Mycenaean Greece that had been closed for more than 30 centuries. Ventris did not live to see his work fully vindicated. On the 6th of September 1956, at age 34, he died in a car accident on the road from Hatfield to his home in London late at night, striking a parked truck in a lay-by on the side of the road. Their joint volume, Documents in Mycenaean Greek, was published posthumously. He had deciphered the earliest recorded form of Greek, extended the reach of that language back by 5 centuries, and given the Mycenaean civilization, for the first time in millennia, a voice. What the Pylos tablets recorded once Ventris and Chadwick had shown how to read them was not poetry, not literature, not history in any recognisable sense. It was bureaucracy. Meticulous, precise, and, in its final entries, increasingly anxious bureaucracy. The tablets list individual workers by name and occupation. They record the quantities of bronze allocated to individual smiths and the number of weapons they were expected to produce. They track the movement of sheep and goats across the landscape, flock by flock. They enumerate the offerings due to individual gods and goddesses at specific sanctuaries. One group of tablets, known to scholars as the OK tablets, describes the deployment of military units to guard specific stretches of coastline. The word OK itself is thought to derive from a Mycenaean Greek word meaning command or watch. These tablets list the commanders by name, specify the number of men under their command, and identify the coastal sectors they were assigned to defend. Other tablets refer to rowers, men assigned to specific ships, drawn from specific villages, allocated specific rations. There is debate about what the OK tablets actually indicate. Eric Klein and others have cautioned that they do not explicitly state what the coastguards were watching for. The text does not name an enemy. But the existence of the tablets, combined with the destruction of the palace shortly after they were written, is suggestive. At minimum, the palace authorities of Pylos knew that a seaborne threat of some kind existed, and they were positioning their forces to respond to it. At maximum, they knew that attack was coming and were trying to prepare. Preparations that, in the event, were not enough. The final tablets at Pylos record what appears to be a mobilization. Bronze is being distributed to smiths for the urgent manufacture of weapons. Offerings are being made to the gods, offerings of an exceptional character, including, on one controversial tablet, what may be references to human beings as part of the ritual, though the interpretation is debated. The palace was reaching for every resource it had, spiritual and material, to meet a crisis whose nature we can only infer. And the crisis came, and the palace burned, and the tablets that recorded the preparations were fired to permanence in the same conflagration that destroyed everything they had tried to prevent. Before we leave Pylos, one more object deserves a moment of attention, because it reminds us that the civilization being destroyed was not primitive, was not crude, and may well have achieved artistic heights we have not yet fully recovered. In 2015, a team led by Jack Davis and Sharon Stocker of the University of Cincinnati excavated an undisturbed tomb near the Palace of Nestor. It belonged to a man who had been buried around 1450 BC, before the final destruction, in the era of Mycenaean expansion and confidence. The man was accompanied in death by an extraordinary array of grave goods, and the excavators came to call him the Griffin Warrior, after one of the ivory plaques buried with him. Among the objects in his grave was a small seal stone, an agate carved with a minute image. It is only 3.6 centimetres long, and when it was cleaned and studied, it revealed a scene carved with such precision that many of its details can only be seen through photomicroscopy. A warrior in the act of dispatching a second warrior, while a third figure lies defeated beneath them. Individual muscles of the combatants' bodies are rendered, their weapons are ornamented, their jewellery is distinguishable. The skill of the carving is such that scholars have called it the finest work of Aegean Bronze Age glyptic art ever recovered, rivaling in technique anything produced in classical Greece more than 1,000 years later. The implication is quiet and staggering. Whatever we think we know about the capabilities of Mycenaean craftsmen, we probably underestimate them. The combat agate is proof that at least some artisans in Bronze Age Greece possessed techniques we have not yet fully understood, and produced works whose sophistication is not fully accounted for in the standard histories, and whatever knowledge they possessed, whatever techniques, whatever traditions of apprenticeship and training, was swept away when the palaces burned. Much of what was lost we cannot even guess at. Tiryns, just a few miles from Mycenae, offers a different kind of evidence. Before its destruction around 1200 BC, the last generation of Terinthian rulers undertook an astonishingly ambitious building program, what German archaeologists have called the transformation of the site into a Mycenaean Versailles. A new palace with lavish wall paintings, porticos and multiple courts. New massive fortification walls with sally ports and vaulted galleries. A new dam redirecting a nearby stream and draining a marshland to create more agricultural land. And a virtually freestanding wall almost 7 metres thick, built to protect the growing harbour town in the lower citadel, which at that time lay just a kilometre from the coast. This is not the behaviour of a civilization that knew it was dying. This is the behaviour of a civilization at the peak of its confidence, pouring its wealth into monuments that its builders expected to stand for generations. And then the destruction came. Fire and possibly earthquake. The new palace was devastated. The fortification walls tilted and cracked. The beautiful frescoes that had lined the reception halls were smashed and scattered in the debris. But unlike Pylos, Tiryns did not simply cease to exist. The survivors remained on the site. They cleared part of the debris from the central area of the citadel and built a new, simpler building on top of the ruins of the palace, a structure that still incorporated the throne room but lacked the great central hearth, and which stood alone as a single monumental building rather than as the heart of a larger palatial complex. On the plain around the hill, new living quarters were constructed for the people who had previously been confined to the lower city. Remarkably, the population of Tiryns appears to have increased after the palace destruction. At its post-palatial peak around 1150 BC, the city may have held as many as 15,000 inhabitants, a larger population than it had supported at the height of Mycenaean palace civilization. The kind of life they were living was entirely different, less centrally organised, less hierarchical, less dependent on redistribution from a royal centre. But they were living, they were surviving, they were adapting. The collapse of the palaces did not mean the extinction of the Greeks, it meant the end of one way of being Greek. Another would eventually emerge, slowly, over centuries, built on different foundations. In the meantime, the silence settled over the land. The tablets stopped being written. The wall paintings were not renewed. The Cyclopean walls stood, but the people who had commissioned them were gone. The name of the Wonax, the Mycenaean king, faded from memory, leaving behind eventually the Homeric word Anax, applied in the Iliad to Agamemnon and others, a dim echo of an institution that had ceased to exist before the poet was born. Homer would sing centuries later of heroes who sailed to Troy in a great armada. He did so in a language, the Greek alphabet, that had not existed in Mycenaean times. He described cities and peoples that his own contemporaries had never seen, using names and details preserved through 4 centuries of oral tradition. Some of what he preserved was recognizable Bronze Age reality, distorted and embroidered by generations of retelling. Much of it was the imaginative creation of a dark age trying to remember a golden one. What is most striking, though, is how much he did manage to preserve. The great walled citadels, the bronze armour, the catalogue of ships, the names of places that had vanished from the map but had lodged in the collective memory. These details, too specific and too consistent to be invented, are the faint flickers of a civilization whose written record had been lost, but whose oral memory refused to die entirely. The Bronze Age sang itself into the classical world through 400 silent years. And when writing returned, writing in the new, simpler form of the alphabet, it was the song of the Mycenaeans, remembered imperfectly, that was among the first things written down. Return now to the Syrian coast, and to the city whose last letters we met at the beginning of this story. Ugarit in its final decades was not a declining civilization. Its destruction, when it came, did not catch a city already in obvious decay. On the contrary, the excavations at Ras Shamra, conducted by the French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer, beginning in 1929 and continued by successors, including Henri de Contenson, Jean Margueron, and Marguerite Yon, have revealed no obvious social, political, or economic decay preceding the fall. Ugarit was destroyed at the height of its vitality. The city fell suddenly, as the result of a terrible catastrophe whose specific character the tablets themselves only partially explain. This is what makes the last letters of Ugarit unlike any other documents from the ancient world. They are not the self-conscious reflections of a civilization in obvious decline. They are the real-time correspondence of a city that believed itself prosperous and capable, right up until the moment it was overwhelmed. They are records of people surprised by disaster, who did not have the perspective of hindsight that allows us, reading their words 3,000 years later, to see the larger pattern they were caught in. The royal palace of Ugarit contained 90 rooms arranged around 8 enclosed courtyards, with separate wings for administrative functions. The archives were organised by subject: the Western Archive, the Eastern Archive, the Southern Archive, the Central Archive, each holding documents of a different administrative category. The excavators, as they uncovered each wing, began to recognise patterns: tablets concerning foreign correspondence in one place, tablets concerning domestic legal matters in another, tablets concerning religious ritual in a third. And there were the private archives. Rapanu, whose house yielded hundreds of diplomatic tablets, seems to have served as an important civil official, perhaps something like a Minister of Foreign Affairs, handling correspondence that circled through his office rather than going directly to the king. His library contained letters from all over the eastern Mediterranean, many of them concerning Ugarit's relations with the Hittites, with Egypt, with Cyprus, and with lesser powers in the region. Ertenu's house, excavated more recently between 1973 and the 1990s, produced an even more extensive archive, some 650 tablets, arranged in what appear to have been rooms functioning as a combined office and reading room. Ertenu was a merchant, but not an ordinary one. His correspondence touches on matters of diplomacy, trade, law, and private family life. His business partners extended from Egypt to the Hittite lands to Cyprus and beyond. His wealth must have been substantial. The tablets in Ertenu's archive, when arranged chronologically, show a transition that scholars have found deeply affecting. The earlier tablets are routine: trade correspondence, shipping manifests, price negotiations, the ordinary business of a prosperous commercial city going about its daily affairs. And then, gradually, the tone begins to change. The word biru, hunger, appears. Trade correspondence becomes more anxious. Expected shipments are not arriving, ships are delayed, or do not come at all. There are reports of unrest along the coastal trade routes. Raiders, perhaps. Or perhaps just the breakdown of the regular rhythms of commerce that had sustained the city for centuries. King Amurapi, the last king of Ugarit, ruled from approximately 1215 BC. He was a contemporary of the Hittite king Suppiluliuma II, the last known Hittite king, and his reign coincides almost exactly with the final collapse of both civilizations. Amurapi wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh about severe hunger in his land, begging for grain to save his life and the lives of his citizens. He wrote to the Hittite viceroy at Carchemish, the major administrative centre to the north, requesting military forces and chariots. He wrote to the king of Al-Ashir warning that enemy ships had been sighted off the coast, and in the letter that has come to bear the catalogue number R, S18.147, a tablet preserved in the fire that destroyed the palace, Amurapi revealed the full extent of his vulnerability. "My father," he wrote, "behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned. They did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Lucca? Thus, the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us." His army was not in Ugarit. It had been deployed to the Hittite lands to fulfill Ugarit's treaty obligations to its overlord. His navy was not in the harbour. His ships had been sent to patrol the Lycian coast, the Lucca, far to the west, probably in response to the same general threat that was now, having evaded his fleet, striking his home city instead, a coastal city, undefended by land or sea, with enemy ships on the horizon and hunger in the streets. Among the tablets found in the ruins of Ugarit was a reply Amurapi had received from abroad, advice urging him to stand firm. "Be firm," the letter urged. "Where are your troops? Where are your chariots? Are they not with you? If ships have indeed been sighted, then strengthen your defences and hold your ground." The origin of this letter is itself a subject of scholarly debate. It was traditionally attributed to the king of Al-Ashir, Cyprus, but some researchers, including Sylvie Lachenbacher, have argued that it may have come from the viceroy of Carchemish. Petrographic analysis of the tablet's clay, conducted in the early 21st century by a team led by Yuval Goran, found mineral compositions consistent with a Cypriot origin, supporting the traditional attribution, though the question has not been definitively settled. In either case, the advice must have rung hollow. Amurapi's forces were not with him. They were hundreds of miles away, fulfilling obligations to an overlord who was itself collapsing. There was no holding the ground when there were no troops to hold it with. Not all the last letters of Ugarit came from the king. The most human in some ways came from ordinary people whose names would not otherwise survive. One such letter was written by a man named Ua Sharuma to the mother of the Ugaritic king. Ua Sharuma describes the approach of the enemy with dread, but closes with a line whose emotional directness still cuts through the millennia between him and us. "And behold, the enemies oppress me," he writes, "but I shall not leave my wife and my children before the enemy." There is no elaborate rhetoric here, no diplomatic phrasing, only the quiet commitment of a man who knows what is coming and has made his decision. He will stay. Whatever happens, he will stay with his family. Whatever happens, they will face it together. We do not know what happened to Ua Sharuma. We do not know whether he and his family escaped, or whether they were among the unburied dead the excavators found in the streets of Ugarit when they finally reached the destruction layer. What we know is that his letter was written and pressed into clay and left in a building that caught fire and survived. His last words, or near last, are a simple promise of loyalty to the people he loved. That is, in the end, perhaps the most extraordinary thing the archives of Ugarit contain, not the diplomatic correspondence, not the king's desperate requests, but the single clear note of an ordinary man in a crisis he did not understand, doing the only thing he knew how to do. The destruction of Ugarit was violent and total. In the excavation layers corresponding to the city's final hours, archaeologists found arrowheads scattered through the palace, the temples, and the residential quarters, hundreds of them, concentrated in patterns that suggest house-to-house fighting. The remains of individuals who had not been buried, left where they fell, unattended, unceremonious, were recovered in rooms and streets. Evidence of intense fire was found in virtually every major structure. After the destruction, nothing. No rebuilding, no resettlement, no temporary occupation by squatters or refugees. Ugarit was annihilated so thoroughly that the site was simply abandoned. completely and permanently. The orchards grew wild, the harbour silted in, the ruins crumbled and were buried by wind-blown soil and the slow accumulation of organic material. For more than 3,000 years, Ugarit ceased to exist in any form, physical, political, or memorial. Its name disappeared from living languages. Its location was forgotten. No later civilization remembered it. No tradition preserved its memory. The farmers of Ottoman Syria who worked the fields over its buried ruins did not know they were farming atop the graves of a vanished civilization. Not until 1928, when a local farmer ploughing a field on the northern coast near Latakia accidentally broke through the roof of an ancient underground tomb, did the city begin to emerge from its long burial. Claude Schaefer's team arrived the following year. The first season of excavation, a month in, turned up the scribal school and library adjoining the Temple of Dagon. The tablets began to emerge from the ground, still bearing the messages pressed into them on the day the world ended. Thousands followed, over nearly a century of excavation. They continue to emerge. The Ertenu archive in particular is still being studied. New tablets are cleaned, read and published every few years. A civilization that had been utterly erased from human memory had left behind a record so complete that scholars, a century after the discovery, are still catching up with it. And at the centre of that record are the letters we began with, the last correspondence of a king and his people, written in the final weeks of their city, pressed into clay that was never supposed to last, preserved by fire that was meant to destroy everything. Of all the great powers of the Late Bronze Age, only one survived the catastrophe more or less intact. Egypt endured. It endured shrunken, exhausted, economically drained, and politically weakened. It would never again project power on the scale of the New Kingdom. It would never again maintain an empire in the Levant. Within a century of the crisis, it would fracture into rival kingdoms during the Third Intermediate Period, and the long, slow diminishment of pharaonic civilization would begin. But it survived. And because it survived, we have something from Egypt that we do not have from any of the other civilizations caught in the collapse. A record written by the people who fought the crisis and won. On the west bank of the Nile, across the river from the modern city of Luxor, stands the mortuary temple of Rameses III. It is called Medinet Habu, and it is by any measure one of the most extraordinary documents in the ancient world. A document written not in clay or papyrus, but in stone. The walls of Medinet Habu are covered in carved reliefs depicting the military campaigns of Rameses III, land battles, naval engagements, processions of captives, scenes of the pharaoh in his chariot and in his warship. And alongside the images, cut deep into the stone, are some of the longest and most detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions surviving from ancient Egypt. These inscriptions describe, in language that combines royal propaganda with what appears to be genuine urgency, the arrival of a coalition of peoples from across the sea, groups that modern scholars have collectively designated the Sea Peoples, following a term first coined in 1881 by the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero. The inscription from the 8th year of Rameses III's reign, approximately 1177 BC by conventional dating, contains a passage that has been quoted in virtually every account of the Bronze Age collapse ever written. The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Carchemish, Azawa, and Alashia on, being cut off at one time. A camp was set up in one place in Amuru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Read those words again. From Hatti, the Hittite Empire. From Kode, a region in southern Anatolia. From Carchemish, the great city on the Euphrates. From Azawa, the kingdoms of western Anatolia. From Alashia, Cyprus. All cut off at one time, all destroyed. Their lands, says the Egyptian scribe, like that which has never come into being. Not just defeated, unmade, returned to non-existence, as if they had never been. And these people, whoever they were now heading for Egypt. Rameses names them, across several different inscriptions, the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denian, the Weshesh. In earlier Egyptian records, from the reign of his predecessor Meneptah some 30 years before, additional names appear, the Shurden, the Luka, the Ekwesh, the Teresh. Scholars have spent more than a century trying to identify these groups, with varying degrees of confidence and considerable ongoing debate. The identifications range from well-supported to highly speculative, and the scholarly consensus continues to evolve. The Peliset are the most firmly identified. They are widely accepted to be the ancestors of the Philistines, who settled on the southern coast of Canaan, and appear prominently in the Hebrew Bible, in the stories of Samson, Goliath, and the long conflicts with the early Israelite monarchy. The phonological similarity between Peliset and Philistine is clear. The Hebrew word for the land of the Philistines, Peleshet, becomes the Greek Palestine and the modern English Palestine. Archaeological evidence confirms the connection. A new material culture, distinctive bichrome pottery, Aegean-style hearths, the consumption of pork, Aegean-related plaster techniques, appears in the southern Levantine coastal cities of Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, Gath and Gaza at precisely the moment when Egyptian records describe the arrival of the Peliset, and there is now genetic evidence as well. In 2019, a team led by researchers at the Max Planck Institute, working with the Leon Levy expedition to Ashkelon, published a study in the journal Science Advances reporting genome-wide data from 10 Bronze and Iron Age individuals buried at Ashkelon. The early Iron Age population, the generation that arrived at the Bronze to Iron Age transition coincident with the Sea Peoples phase, was found to be genetically distinct from the preceding Bronze Age Canaanite population, due to a European-related admixture. In later generations, this genetic signal diluted and eventually disappeared as the newcomers intermarried with the local population and were absorbed. But for the first generation or two, the genetic evidence supports what the archaeological evidence had suggested. The Philistines arrived at Ashkelon from somewhere in southern Europe, most likely the Aegean. The Sherden have been tentatively connected to Sardinia, the Shekelesh to Sicily, the Luca to the Lycian coast of southwestern Turkey, the Denian possibly to the Danoi, one of Homer's names for the Greeks, though this identification is contested. Each of these connections is plausible, none is certain. What seems increasingly clear is that the Sea Peoples were not a single ethnic group but a coalition, or perhaps more accurately, a collection of overlapping coalitions, drawn from multiple regions and formed under pressure of circumstances. The traditional narrative, established in the 19th century, presented the Sea Peoples as the destroyers, a vast wave of barbarian invaders who swept down upon the civilized world and smashed it to pieces. Recent scholarship has progressively complicated this picture. The reliefs at Medinet Habu themselves resist the simple narrative. The famous battle scenes show not only warriors, but entire families on the move. Ox-drawn carts carrying women and children appear in the midst of the conflict. This is not the imagery of a military strike force. It is, at least in part, the imagery of a mass migration. People travelling with everything they owned, seeking a new place to live because the old place could no longer sustain them. And the timing is critical. The Sea Peoples appear in Egyptian records at exactly the same moment when every other indicator, the grain letters, the climate data, the pollen records, the tree rings, the archaeological destruction layers, shows the Eastern Mediterranean in systemic crisis. The Hittite Empire was already collapsing from drought and internal fragmentation. Mycenaean Greece was already in the process of abandoning its palatial centres. The trade networks were already breaking down. The Sea Peoples did not arrive in a healthy world and break it. They arrived in a world that was already breaking. Recent critical work by archaeologists, including Jesse Millick, has also reduced the number of sites that can be reliably identified as destroyed during the collapse. Of the 148 sites with 153 destruction events that have at various times been ascribed to the end of the Late Bronze Age, Millick's review found that approximately 61% have been misdated, assumed without sufficient evidence, or simply never happened. The collapse was real, but it was less uniform, less simultaneous, and less universally destructive than the early 20th century narrative suggested. Some places survived. Some were destroyed for local reasons that had nothing to do with the Sea Peoples or with drought. The pattern was a pattern, but it was not the overwhelming tidal wave of destruction that earlier generations of scholars imagined. What seems to be emerging from the best current scholarship is a picture in which the Sea Peoples were both a cause and a consequence. Some of them were probably organised raiders, military forces operating across the sea for plunder and territorial gain. Some of them were refugees, displaced populations fleeing drought and famine in their own regions. Most of them may have been a mixture, with the composition shifting from group to group and from season to season. They took advantage of a system already in disarray. They accelerated failures that were already underway, but they were not the only cause, and they may not even have been the most important one. The Medinet Habu inscriptions remain the fullest surviving contemporary account of the crisis, as perceived by one of its witnesses, but they are inevitably the account of the winner. They do not tell us how the Hittites understood what was happening, or the Mycenaeans, or the people of Ugarit, because those civilizations did not survive to write the history. We know only what Egypt chose to remember, carved deep into the stone of a pharaoh's mortuary temple, where it has been waiting in full sunlight for more than 3,000 years. Rameses III fought them off. This much the evidence supports, even accounting for the inevitable exaggeration of pharaonic propaganda. The land battle occurred somewhere in the region of Jahi, roughly corresponding to modern-day southern Lebanon, where the Egyptian army intercepted a mass movement of peoples heading south along the Levantine coast. The naval battle took place near the mouth of the Nile, the so-called Battle of the Delta, where Egyptian forces lured the Sea People's ships into confined waters and destroyed them with volleys of arrows from archers stationed on the shore and in Egyptian vessels. The inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe the Egyptian victory in emphatic terms. Those who reached my boundary, their seed is not. Their hearts and their souls are finished forever and ever. The pharaoh's language has the ring of someone who knows, without quite saying so, that the outcome was closer than the official record suggests, and the cost was enormous. Egypt repelled the invasion, but the effort depleted its treasury and exhausted its military capacity. Within a generation, the workers at the village of Deir el-Medina, the artisans responsible for constructing and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, went on strike. It is the earliest documented labour action in recorded history, though earlier, unrecorded instances almost certainly occurred. Their complaint was simple and devastating. They had not been paid. The grain rations that constituted their wages had not been delivered. The men walked off the job and assembled at the mortuary temples demanding their due. This was not a political revolution. It was an economic failure. The Egyptian state, weakened by years of military expenditure and disrupted trade, could no longer meet its basic obligation to feed the workers who served it. The strike was eventually resolved, the rations were delivered, and work resumed. But the episode reveals the depth of the fiscal crisis that Egypt was experiencing even in its moment of military triumph. And then came the harem conspiracy. Court records discovered in the 19th century, the judicial papyrus of Turin and related documents, describe an elaborate plot against Rameses III, organised by one of his secondary wives, a woman named T, and a group of court officials and military officers. The conspiracy aimed to place T's son Pentuer on the throne in place of the designated heir. The plot was discovered, and the conspirators were tried and punished with varying degrees of severity. Some were executed outright. Others were forced to take their own lives. The trial records are detailed and bureaucratic, listing the names, ranks and crimes of each participant. But the key question, whether Rameses himself survived the assassination attempt or was killed by it, remained uncertain for more than 3,000 years. It was not until 2012, when a team led by Zahi Hawass and Albert Zink published the results of CT scans performed on Rameses III's mummy in the British Medical Journal, that an answer began to emerge. The scans revealed a deep, wide wound across the pharaoh's throat, consistent with a blade attack, that had been concealed beneath thick layers of linen wrappings by the ancient embalmers. While it is not possible to state with absolute certainty that this wound was the cause of death, the evidence strongly suggests that the conspiracy succeeded and that Rameses III was assassinated. Rameses III, the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom, the man who had saved Egypt from the Sea Peoples, was murdered by conspirators within his own court. The civilization survived. The king did not, and the civilization that survived was not quite the same. The 20th dynasty limped on for another century or so, under a succession of pharaohs who also took the name Rameses, but whose reigns were increasingly dominated by the priests of Amun at Thebes, the collapse of royal authority in the south, and the slow fracturing of the kingdom into rival power centres. When the dynasty finally ended around 1069 BC, Egypt entered the Third Intermediate Period, a long era of political fragmentation, foreign rule and diminished power. The empire that had survived the Bronze Age collapse paid for its survival with the long, slow fade of its greatness. Here is something that should change the way we think about 1177 BC. It was not the first time. 1,000 years before Ugarit burned, 1,000 years before the Hittites abandoned Hattusa and the Mycenaean palaces crumbled, another great civilization of Mesopotamia had collapsed under circumstances whose broad outlines are hauntingly familiar. The Akkadian Empire. Founded by Sargon of Akkad around 2334 BC, the Akkadian state is often described as the first true empire in world history. Sargon, whose name means the king is legitimate, a fact that immediately raises the question of why he felt the need to say so, rose from obscure origins to unite the rival city-states of Sumer and Akkad under a single authority. At its height, his empire controlled trade routes stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. His grandson Naram-Sin took the imperial ideology even further, styling himself as a god and commissioning the famous victory stele that shows him ascending a mountain toward the heavens, towering above his enemies, wearing the horned crown of divinity. It was an age of unprecedented centralization and ambition, and it lasted in its full form barely a century. Around 2200 BC, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. The northern agricultural provinces, the rain-fed breadbasket that had supplied the grain to feed the armies and support the palace economy, were devastated by an abrupt and severe drought that modern climate science has confirmed with increasing precision. The city of Tel Leilan, a major Akkadian administrative centre in northern Syria that has been extensively excavated by Harvey Weiss of Yale University, provides the most vivid archaeological evidence. The site shows what appears to have been a thriving urban centre, with monumental buildings, extensive grain storage facilities, and all the markers of a prosperous and well-organised society that was suddenly and completely abandoned around 2200 BC. When Weiss's team examined the soil layers corresponding to this period, they found that the rich, dark agricultural earth of the preceding centuries was abruptly replaced by a thick deposit of wind-blown dust and fine sand. This layer of Aeolian sediment, the kind of material that accumulates when fields lie bare and unploughed, when irrigation channels run dry and topsoil is picked up by the wind, is roughly a metre thick. It represents approximately 3 centuries of desolation. 3 centuries during which what had been productive farmland was transformed into something close to desert. The population did not simply die in place, they migrated, and we know this because the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia, the irrigated lowlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, shows a corresponding population surge at the same time. Refugees from the drought-stricken north flooded into the south, overwhelming the existing communities and straining their resources. The response of the southern city-states is recorded both archaeologically and textually. A massive defensive wall constructed between the 2 rivers, the repeller of the Amorites, built by the rulers of the Ur III dynasty that succeeded the Akkadians, stretched approximately 180 kilometres across the Mesopotamian plain. It was not primarily a military fortification against an invading army. It was a border wall built to manage the flow of environmental refugees. It is among the oldest known physical structures built explicitly to control human migration driven by climate change. Sediment cores from the Gulf of Oman contain a distinct layer of wind-blown mineral dust, concentrated with dolomite and calcite from the deserts of Mesopotamia, that begins precisely at the time of the Akkadian collapse and persists for roughly 300 years. Tree ring data and cave deposits from across the Near East confirm a significant shift toward drier conditions beginning around 4,200 years ago, the event known to climatologists as the 4.2 kiloyear event. The parallels to the modern world are difficult to ignore: a drought, a collapse of agriculture, mass migration from affected regions to those that still have resources, border walls built to manage the resulting population movements. These are not ancient problems. They're contemporary headlines, enacted for the first time more than 4,000 years ago. And the scribes of Mesopotamia recorded the catastrophe in a text that would be copied and recopied for more than 1,000 years. The composition known to modern scholars as the Curse of Akkad, or more formally the Cursing of Ugarit, was composed during the Ur III period, perhaps 1 or 2 centuries after the events it describes. It is not a straightforward historical chronicle. It is a literary work, a theological narrative that frames the collapse of the Akkadian Empire as divine punishment for the hubris of Naram-Sin, who allegedly desecrated the temple of the god Enlil at the city of Nippur. But embedded within its theological framework are descriptions of environmental catastrophe that align with remarkable precision to what the archaeological and climatological evidence has since confirmed. The large arable tracts yielded no grain. The inundated fields yielded no fish. The irrigated orchards yielded no syrup or wine. The gathered clouds did not rain. Fields that produced nothing. Irrigation systems that failed. Orchards that dried up. And overhead, a sky that had simply stopped delivering water. The text goes on to describe a world turned upside down, prices rising to impossible levels, social order breaking down, the mighty reduced to begging. It is a work of literary and political propaganda, certainly. The scribes of the Ur III dynasty had their own reasons for portraying the Akkadians as impious and deserving of divine wrath. But the environmental details are too specific, too closely aligned with what we now know was happening to the climate, to be dismissed as pure invention. The Curse of Akkad preserves within its literary form a cultural memory of genuine catastrophe, and here is the detail that makes the hair stand up. The scribes of the Late Bronze Age, the scribes of Ugarit, of Hattusa, of the Mycenaean palaces, they knew the Curse of Akkad. It was a famous text. It was widely copied. It was studied in scribal schools as part of the standard curriculum of literary education. Students learning to write cuneiform practice by copying its lines. Fragments of it have been recovered from scribal contexts across the ancient Near East, including places that were themselves about to be destroyed by the same pattern the text described. The educated class of the Bronze Age world had in their hands a detailed literary account of what happens when climate shifts, when harvests fail, when trade collapses, and when the complex systems that sustain civilized life break down under environmental stress. They had the warning, they read it, they copied it, they taught it to their students, and then they lived through it again, not because they were foolish, not because they ignored what they knew, but because the kind of knowledge preserved in a literary text does not translate easily into the kind of action needed to restructure an economy, diversify a food supply, or build resilience into a system that has been optimized for efficiency. They could read the Curse of Akkad. They could not read their own future in it. Not until the parallels became too obvious to deny, and by then it was too late. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end. It felt like the end certainly to those who lived through it. To King Amurapi of Ugarit, watching enemy ships approach his undefended coast. To the last Hittite officials, gathering their records and setting fire to their own capital before disappearing into the Anatolian interior. To the Mycenaean palace scribes, setting down their styluses for the last time as the flames approached. For them, the world was ending. The only world they had known or could imagine. But the world did not end. It transformed. And the transformation, once it began, was in many ways more revolutionary than anything the Bronze Age had produced. The most fundamental change was technological. The Bronze Age had been defined, and limited, by bronze itself, an alloy that required copper and tin in specific proportions, with tin sourced from deposits thousands of miles away. This dependency had made long-distance trade not merely useful but essential, and had concentrated wealth and power in the hands of those who controlled the trade routes. Iron changed everything. Iron ore is one of the most abundant minerals on the planet's surface. It is found in virtually every region of the world. It does not require rare materials imported over vast distances. It requires only the knowledge of how to smelt and forge it. Knowledge that, once acquired, could be replicated locally by any community with access to a charcoal fire and a deposit of ore. The transition from bronze to iron was not instantaneous. It was gradual and uneven, taking centuries to complete. Iron had been known in the Bronze Age. The Hittites in particular had experimented with it, and small quantities of iron objects are found in Bronze Age contexts from Egypt to the Aegean. But iron had remained a prestige material, produced on a small scale, valued more for its rarity than for its practical superiority. What changed after the collapse was the context. With the trade routes that had distributed tin suddenly unreliable, with the palace economies that had concentrated metal production suddenly gone, iron became the practical choice. It was locally available. It did not require a long-distance trade network to produce. Any community with the right knowledge and the right kind of ore could equip itself. The Iron Age, which emerged from the ruins of the Bronze Age, was a fundamentally different kind of world. Less centralized, less interconnected at first, but also less fragile. The critical dependency that had made the Bronze Age both powerful and vulnerable, the absolute need for materials that could only be obtained through trade, was broken. Among the peoples who emerged from the collapse with remarkable speed and adaptability were the Phoenicians. The Phoenician city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos and others, occupied the very same stretch of the Lebanese and Syrian coast that had once been home to trading cities like Ugarit. They inherited in some sense Ugarit's commercial position and its commercial ethos, but they built something new with it. The Phoenicians became the great maritime traders of the early Iron Age, establishing commercial networks that eventually stretched from the Levant to North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, Spain, and possibly beyond. They founded colonies, most famously Carthage, on the coast of modern Tunisia, that would grow into major powers in their own right. Their trade was not organised by palaces and kings, as it had been in the Bronze Age. It was organised by independent merchants, operating on their own account, bearing their own risks and reaping their own profits. Decentralised, more modest in scale per transaction, but vastly more resilient to the kinds of shocks that had destroyed the earlier system, and they carried with them a technology that would transform the world far more profoundly than any cargo of copper or tin: the alphabet. The writing systems of the Bronze Age, Linear B, Akkadian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, Hittite cuneiform, even the relatively streamlined Ugaritic alphabet, shared a common characteristic: they were difficult. Mastering any of them required years of specialised training, and in practice, literacy was restricted to a tiny professional class of scribes who served the palace administrations. Ordinary people could not read or write. Writing was a technology of the elite, by the elite, for the elite. The Phoenician alphabet, a streamlined, purely consonantal writing system of just 22 characters, was the culmination of experiments that had been underway in the Levant for centuries. Early alphabetic inscriptions from the Sinai Peninsula and from various sites in Canaan date to the Middle and Late Bronze Age, and show that the concept was already in circulation. Ugarit itself had used an alphabetic cuneiform of 30 signs. The Phoenicians simplified further, reducing the signs, regularising their forms, and most importantly, popularising the system outside the narrow professional scribal class. It was a system that anyone could learn. A person of average intelligence could master it in weeks rather than years. It did not require an elaborate training infrastructure. It could be taught informally, from parent to child, from merchant to apprentice, from sailor to sailor. The Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet around the 8th century BC, adding symbols for vowel sounds and creating the first fully phonetic alphabet in history. The consequences cascaded through all of subsequent human history. Widespread literacy made possible the Greek invention of democracy, a system of government that presupposed informed citizens capable of reading laws, decrees, and arguments. It made possible the Greek traditions of philosophy, drama, and historical writing. It made possible the Hebrew Bible, composed and transmitted in an alphabetic script. It made possible eventually the entire literary and intellectual tradition of the Western world, and it was born from the ruins of a collapsed civilization. The palace scribes of the Bronze Age had kept their knowledge locked behind the barrier of complex writing systems that only they could read. When the palaces burned and the scribes dispersed, that barrier was destroyed along with everything else, and in its place arose a writing system that anyone could learn, a democratization of knowledge that the Bronze Age world, for all its achievements, had never contemplated. Not every Bronze Age society was annihilated, and the differences between those that survived and those that did not are instructive. Assyria contracted dramatically during the collapse but did not disappear. The Assyrian heartland, centred on the Tigris River in northern Mesopotamia, was less dependent on maritime trade than the coastal civilizations, and had access to its own agricultural base, irrigated by the great rivers. Assyria retreated to its core territory, maintained its political continuity, and eventually, over the course of several centuries, rebuilt itself into the most powerful military empire the ancient Near East had ever seen. The Neo-Assyrian Empire of the 9th through 7th centuries BC was, in many ways, a successor state that remembered the Bronze Age and drew on its legacy. Carchemish, the Hittite administrative centre on the Euphrates, also survived the general collapse, apparently withstanding the attacks that destroyed so many of its neighbours. It became the seat of a Neo-Hittite successor state that preserved elements of Hittite culture, language, and political tradition long after the empire itself had vanished. The Luwian hieroglyphic script, once a secondary writing system in the Hittite world, continued in use at Carchemish and related sites for several centuries, a thread of cultural continuity that bridged the gap between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. In the highlands of Canaan, communities that had existed on the margins of the Great Bronze Age civilizations found themselves, suddenly and unexpectedly, free from the imperial pressures that had shaped their existence for centuries. With Egyptian and Hittite authority withdrawn, these highland settlements had the opportunity to develop independently, to consolidate their identities, organize their communities, and begin the process that would eventually produce the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Out of these communities, over the following centuries, would emerge the Hebrew Bible, a body of literature shaped in part by the memory of the chaotic era in which its earliest traditions were formed. The Phoenicians themselves, as we have seen, inherited the commercial role of the old Levantine cities. The Philistines, the descendants of the Peliset, settled along the southern Levantine coast and established their five-city confederation, the Pentapolis of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Within a few generations, they had acculturated to local Canaanite traditions so thoroughly that their distinctive genetic markers faded from the population, and their material culture blended with the surrounding Levantine world. The survivors of the Bronze Age collapse were, in general, those who were either isolated enough to avoid the worst of the cascading failures, or adaptable enough to restructure their economies and political systems in response to the new reality. Centralized, palace-dependent civilizations tightly integrated into the international trading system, these were the ones that fell hardest. Smaller, more self-sufficient, more locally oriented communities were more likely to endure. Complexity, it turns out, is not the same as resilience. Efficiency is not the same as durability. The systems that are most impressive in their productivity and reach are often the most vulnerable to catastrophic failure, because they have optimized away the redundancies and local capacities that would allow them to absorb shocks and keep functioning when the larger network breaks down. We have travelled now, over the course of these hours, through the records of a world that believed itself permanent and was not. We have read the diplomatic correspondence of kings who addressed each other as brothers, and negotiated the terms of peace and trade with a sophistication that would not seem out of place in any modern diplomatic archive. We have held in our minds the cargo of a sunken ship that carried the products of nearly a dozen civilizations in a single hull. We have watched as the word for hunger crept into the tablets like a stain, slowly at first, then everywhere. We have heard the Hittite officials begging for grain in language that barely concealed their desperation. We have stood inside the mountain city of Hattusa as its royal family packed what they could carry and set fire to what they had to leave behind. We have walked in imagination through the burned palace at Pylos, where the last tablets recorded the deployment of coastal watchers who could not, in the end, prevent what they had been sent to prevent. We have looked at a tiny seal stone carved with a warrior's combat, proof that the civilization being destroyed possessed artistic capacities we still cannot fully explain. We have followed the last king of Ugarit as he wrote letter after letter to allies who could not or would not save him. We have read the simple words of Ugarit, who refused to abandon his wife and children. We have stood before the carved walls of Medinet Habu and read the Egyptian pharaoh's account of a wave of displaced peoples so vast and so relentless that it overwhelmed every civilization in its path, except by the narrowest of margins, his own. We have listened to the curse of Akkad, the lament for an earlier collapse, written 1,000 years before the Bronze Age ended, and studied in the very scribal schools that would produce the last letters of Ugarit. And we have sat with the silence that followed, the 400 years of lost writing, the Greek Dark Ages, when the knowledge of how to read and write was simply forgotten, when everything that the palace scribes had recorded was buried under ash and time, waiting to be rediscovered by people who would not arrive for 32 centuries. Now, in the quiet that comes after all of this, 3 questions remain. The first is a question about what was lost. The palace libraries of the Bronze Age contained more than administrative records. They contained literature, mythology, scientific knowledge, religious texts, medical information, astronomical observations, and accumulated practical wisdom spanning centuries. The royal palace of Ugarit alone housed the Baal cycle, one of the most important surviving Canaanite religious texts, along with hymns, prayers, ritual instructions, legal precedents, and trade records that we are still in the process of cataloguing. The Hittite archives preserved fragments of Hurrian mythology that deeply influenced later Greek traditions. The story of the gods overthrowing their predecessors, echoed centuries later in Hesiod's Theogony, can be traced back to Hurrian sources, preserved only because the Hittites happened to write them down. What survived is only a fraction of what must have existed. When those libraries burned, when the scribal schools closed and the scribes themselves scattered or died, how much of that knowledge vanished permanently? We know what survived, because we have found it in the ruins. We will never know what did not survive. The gaps in our understanding of the ancient world are shaped not only by what the earth has returned to us, but by what the fire consumed beyond recovery. What did those lost tablets say? What did the burned scrolls contain? What did the scattered scribes take with them into exile? And what died with them? We will never fully know. The second question is about pattern. The sequence of events that destroyed the Bronze Age world, climate disruption, agricultural failure, famine, the breakdown of trade networks, the destabilization of centralized authority, mass migration, and the cascading collapse of interconnected systems is not merely a historical curiosity. It is a structural pattern. A pattern that arises whenever complex, tightly coupled, efficiency-optimized systems encounter shocks that exceed their capacity to absorb. The Bronze Age world was not destroyed by a single cause. It was destroyed by a convergence of causes, each one of which, in isolation, the system might have survived. Drought alone would not have brought down the Hittite Empire if the empire had not been simultaneously facing political instability, military overextension, and the breakdown of its trade relationships. The Sea Peoples alone would not have overwhelmed the Eastern Mediterranean if the civilizations they encountered had not already been weakened by decades of famine and economic disruption. The earthquakes that Amos Nuhr of Stanford has argued may have swept through the region in an earthquake storm during the late 13th century would not, by themselves, have destroyed kingdoms that had grain in their storehouses and armies in their fields. It was the combination that proved fatal, the multiplying effect of crises arriving simultaneously in a system too rigidly structured to adapt. The climate shifts exposed the fragility of the agricultural base. The agricultural failure undermined the economic foundation. The economic crisis destabilized the political order. The political instability left borders undefended. The undefended borders attracted raiders and migrants, and the raids and migrations destroyed whatever remained of the commercial infrastructure that might, under different circumstances, have facilitated recovery. This is not a distant, ancient problem. It is a description of systemic risk. And the question it poses to us, to anyone living in a complex, interconnected, globally interdependent world, is not whether it could happen again. It is whether we would recognize the early warnings if it were happening now. The third question is about memory. The Sumerians recorded the fall of Akht. The text was copied, studied, and taught in scribal schools for over a millennium. The educated class of the Bronze Age world had access to a detailed account of civilizational collapse driven by environmental change. And yet, when the same pattern repeated itself 1,000 years later, the warning went unheeded, not because it was unknown, but because knowing about a past catastrophe and having the will and the means to restructure a society to prevent its recurrence are fundamentally different things. What are we recording now that future generations might need? What warnings are we inscribing in our own equivalents of clay that our descendants might read too late? And what would it take not merely to recognize the pattern, but to break it? The tablets of Ugarit did not set out to ask these questions. They were ordinary documents, grain requests, diplomatic letters, military dispatches, composed by scribes who had no idea they were writing the last words of an era. But the fire that was meant to destroy them preserved them instead. And in preserving them, it turned those ordinary documents into something extraordinary, a message from the past to the future, carried across 32 centuries in baked clay, reminding us that the world we live in, whatever world we live in, however permanent it seems, is more fragile than we think. Somewhere in the climate-controlled galleries of museums scattered across the world, in the Louvre in Paris, in the National Museum of Damascus, in the archaeological museums of Aleppo and Latakia when they are accessible, in the British Museum in London, in the collections at Claremont in California, in the Staatliche Museen in Berlin, and in countless university archives, the tablets of the Bronze Age rest behind glass. They are not dramatic to look at. They are small, brown, chipped at the edges. The cuneiform impressions on their surfaces are tiny. You would need to lean close to make them out, and even then, you would see only patterns of small wedge-shaped marks in baked earth. They do not glitter or shine. They do not command attention the way a golden mask or a jewelled sceptre would. But they are, in their way, among the most extraordinary objects in any museum on earth, because they are the unfinished last letters of a world that was writing when it caught fire. The wet clay preserved the moments of interruption, the exact instants when styluses were set down, scribes turned away, and whatever happened next happened without being recorded. The story ends in so many of them in mid-sentence, in mid-thought, the message still reaching toward a reader who would never see it. In the museums near the excavation sites, the tablets of Hattusa line the display cases, the records of an empire that negotiated the world's first peace treaty, that maintained archives in 6 languages, that governed a vast territory with a sophisticated legal code. An empire that could not, in the end, command the rain to fall or the grain to grow. An empire that burned its own capital and walked away into a silence from which it never returned. In the collections of Linear B tablets, now finally readable thanks to the work of Michael Ventris and those who came after him, the voices of the Mycenaean world speak again, of offerings to forgotten gods, of smiths being issued bronze, of rowers allocated to ships, of watchers posted on coasts against threats the scribes did not name. In the ruins of Medinet Habu, the carved walls still show the sea peoples in their distinctive feathered headdresses and horned helmets, advancing in ships with bird-headed prows toward a shore defended by Egyptian archers. Families and ox carts mingled with warriors, people who had lost everything, sailing toward an uncertain fate, captured in stone by the civilization that barely managed to defeat them. These are not mythological texts. These are not legends or fantasies. These are the administrative records, the diplomatic correspondence, and the official inscriptions of real people who lived through the end of their world. People who got up in the morning and went to their scribble desks and pressed their styluses into wet clay, not knowing that the letter they were writing would be the last one, not knowing that the grain they were requesting would never arrive, not knowing that the allies they were begging for help were themselves already overwhelmed. They did what anyone does in a crisis. They communicated, they reached out, they asked for help, they tried to make sense of what was happening, they recorded what they saw, and then the fire came, and then the silence, and then 3,200 years of waiting, until archaeologists, French, German, British, Turkish, American, Syrian, Cypriot, Israeli, dug through the accumulated earth and rubble and found the tablets still there, still intact, still carrying their messages, still reaching out across the void of time towards someone, anyone, who might finally read what they had written. The clay survived because it was meant to be temporary. It was the everyday material of record-keeping, the paper, the whiteboard, the sticky note of the ancient world. Messages were pressed into wet clay, allowed to dry in the sun, read, and eventually recycled. But when the fire came, the temporary became permanent. The heat that destroyed everything else transformed the fragile, erasable surface of the clay into something nearly indestructible. The messages that were supposed to be read once and forgotten were fused into permanence by the very catastrophe that tried to erase them. There is something in that irony that goes beyond archaeology, something about the relationship between destruction and preservation, between what we intend and what actually endures, that the tablets embody in their very material existence. The things we build with the greatest care, the palaces, the temples, the fortifications, are the things that fall, the things we make casually, without thought for the future. A scribbled note, a draft letter, a routine inventory jotted down on a lump of river clay, are the things that survive. Hammurabi did not know he was writing for us. He was writing for the king of Cyprus. He was describing a devastation he could not prevent. He had no thought for posterity, no ambition to leave a message for the future. He was trying to save his city, but his city burned, and his words survived, and tonight, 32 centuries later, we have read them. Let your breathing slow. Let the images of fire and clay and ruined palaces recede. Let the voices of the scribes, the Hittite official begging for grain, the Ugaritic king watching enemy ships on the horizon, the Egyptian pharaoh carving his victory into temple walls he would not live to see completed, the man named Sharuma who would not leave his family. Let those voices settle into the quiet. The tablets are still there, still carrying their warnings, still holding the weight of worlds that believed themselves eternal and were not. They cannot tell us what comes next. They can only tell us what happened once before, in a world not so different from our own. Consider that our own world is connected by supply chains as long and as fragile as the tin roots of the Bronze Age. Consider that our own prosperity depends on materials, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, microchips manufactured in a handful of facilities on the far side of the planet that are concentrated in places beyond our direct control. Consider that our own agricultural systems are calibrated to a climate that is changing faster than at any point in recorded history. Consider that our own institutions, for all their complexity and apparent permanence, rest on assumptions about stability that the Hittites and the Mycenaeans and the scribes of Ugarit once shared. We're not the first civilization to believe itself too advanced to fail. We're not the first to assume that the systems sustaining us are too big, too complex, too essential to break down. The kingdoms of the Bronze Age made the same assumption, and the clay still carries their last words, written in the confident script of people who could not quite believe that the world they knew was ending. The tablets do not offer easy lessons. They do not provide a blueprint for prevention. What they offer is something more valuable and more unsettling. Proof that it has happened before. Proof that sophisticated, literate, diplomatically advanced civilizations can come apart under the weight of stresses that no single generation anticipated. And proof that what follows, though it may take centuries to emerge, can be something new, something different, something that the old world, for all its brilliance, could never have imagined. The alphabet did not exist as democratized technology in the Bronze Age. It emerged from the wreckage. The institutions of the Greek polis did not exist in the Bronze Age. They grew out of the silence that followed. The ethical monotheism of the Hebrew Bible was shaped in the power vacuum left by the retreat of Egyptian and Hittite authority. The great philosophical and scientific traditions of the first millennium BC were built on foundations laid during the very centuries when the written record had gone quiet. Every ending is also a beginning. The world the tablets describe ended in fire. The world that came after was not the one anyone living in the Bronze Age could have predicted. And whatever is coming next in our own age will likewise surprise us. The clay remembers everything. And tonight at least so do we. Sleep well.